Happy Valentine's Day. I need the vice chair to return to his seat.
You need a second on that?
Senator Fagg will be escort you back. Thank you very much. And good morning again. Happy Valentine's Day to everybody. It's a nice day for be a Valentine, but some rain out there. It was good to see. Today we want to talk about Senate Bill 120, and which we'll be hearing and in this committee today, and then after that we'll move on. That's all we're going to work on today. I did want to mention that I have to leave at 9 o'clock. I'm going to go sit in on the Water Committee's testimony that's going on over there, so we can get up hand on how that's progressing. So, but at that point, my able vice chair will take over and make sure we get finished the way it's supposed to be done. So anyway, thank you for that. So we'll begin with Senate Bill 120, and we'll start with the reviser. So welcome to the committee, Tamara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, committee. Senate Bill 120 does two primary things. First, you can see at the top of page 2, the bill would authorize the Secretary of Health and Environment to adopt rules and regulations for an annual certification program for the replacement of segments of distribution systems, so an additional permit would not be needed for those replacement projects. The second thing the bill does is on page 4. And I'm going to tell you, current law authorizes a maximum of a 20-year repayment period for loans from the Kansas Water Pollution Control Revolving Loan Fund to a municipality. Section 2 would change that and would allow any agreements for loans from the fund entered into after July 1 of this year to be repaid within 30 years after that date. And the bill would take effect on July 1, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Tamara. Very good. Any questions for the reviser? Seeing none, we'll call on our first guest testify, Nick Hernandez, City Manager of Dodge City. Welcome to the committee, Nick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee, for allowing me to come and speak before you this morning. City of Dodge City, it does stand in support of both of the amendments to KSA 65-163 and 65-3326. As many of you may know, Dodge City will be home to a new dairy processing facility owned and operated by the Hillmar Cheese Company. The facility is scheduled to be operational late 24 and the city will be responsible for providing the facility's water and wastewater utility services. The facility will actually produce about 1.5 million gallons of additional wastewater per day. And the city is developing plans to expand the treatment capacity at our south wastewater plant to handle both the continued growth of national beef, our growth within the municipal side of the utility, and also the new flow from the Hillmar Cheese Company. Currently, the city manages, believe it or not, 3 billion gallons of municipal wastewater and from both municipal and from national beef processing facilities. The lagoons not only serve as part of our treatment system, but also serve as an irrigation storage for a large complex of over 3,000 irrigated acres of cropland adjacent to the wastewater facility. The city of Dodge City, believe it or not, we recycle almost 100% of our wastewater within the community, and we're very, very proud of those efforts. In addition, we also produce biogas from our wastewater facility as a renewable natural gas source. We produce about 500 million BTUs a year, which is enough to power 5,500 homes. So we're pretty proud of that. Also, the city is currently evaluating a plan to utilize the Hillmar wastewater along with our excess waste stream from municipal flows to develop a managed aquifer recharge project. This project will return approximately 4 million gallons per day, or about 1.5 billion gallons of water back to the aquifer per year. This project returns the treated wastewater to the Ark River, and it will utilize the dry riverbed and the alluvium to further cleanse the water and recharge the aquifer in the vicinity of many of our public water supply wells. So basically, in closing, the city is, the simple amendment to KSA 65163 will allow Dodge City and other Kansas public water suppliers to more efficiently implement water distribution projects, and also will maximize the use of qualified engineering staff that we do have within the city. So thank you.
Very much. Any questions for Nick? Seeing none, thank you very much. You're probably to go testify at the water office next door. Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Josh Waddy on behalf of Kansas Municipal Utilities. Welcome to the committee, Josh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Happy Valentine's Day, and I love you so much that we brought this fairly benign bill that does definitely need to happen, but it's pretty non-controversial. So I appreciate having the testimony of Dodge City go in front of us, because you can hear in a real life scenario what they would like to have out of this. And when Dodge City approached and said, hey, we would like to extend this out, the municipal utilities realized this would actually be a benefit to a lot of communities across the state of Kansas. And so yes, we should do it. And that's how the amortization period came about. And then as we began to pull this apart, we started thinking, what are some other things that we could potentially do to make it more streamlined for all of our communities and their water and wastewater systems as they work to get them certified. And so that's why the additional piece is in there about qualified professional engineers. Not every community in the state has a qualified professional engineer on staff. In fact, it's probably only around a dozen. Dodge City does have 2, in fact, on their staff. But that particular part of the bill, we already allow extensions of water systems to be certified by communities that have a qualified engineer on their staff. This would also just be for the replacements as well. And I don't want to speak for the Department of Health and Environment, but I think they would say the same thing, and you know this if you hear testimony in other committees. All levels of state government, local government, all of us are struggling to hire engineers right now because of the pay scale issue, but that's true also at KDHE. And so if we can find efficiencies to get things certified in a faster way while continuing to maintain safety, then that works better for all groups involved. And so that's why the engineering piece is in there. The amortization piece would be fantastic for a bunch of different communities, and I would stand for questions as well.
Thank you very much. Good report. Any questions for Senator Reichman?
Thank you. I wasn't going to ask the one from Dodge City. I just thought I'd ask you.
He's going to know better than I do.
No, it's an easy question, I think. Let's just focus a little bit from the 20 to 30 years. That's going to be an option, obviously, for the municipalities to do that. But I wish you'd just speak to that piece. Thank you.
Sure, and that does bring up a good point. It is not mandatory. It is an option, and we have a companion bill going through the House as well, and it was testified yesterday, so I don't want to speak on behalf of KDHE, but they even said the project, of course, has to last the 30 years if they're going to approve an amortization period of that length. So if the project is not going to last that long, then it wouldn't. But when we talk about water infrastructure projects, there are some drinking water systems in this state and some stormwater systems in the state that are upwards of 100 years old or longer. And so some of these systems are designed, obviously, to last a long, long time. So a 30-year amortization period is not out of line at all.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Josh? Seeing none, thank you very much, Josh. Our next proponent is Tom Stiles, Kansas Department of Health and Environment. Welcome to the committee, Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm Tom Stiles. I'm Director of Bureau of Water at KDHE. The previous 2 conferees basically have outlined this. It's a very straightforward bill. It does 2 things. One, it allows for clean water SRF loans to be extended out to 30 years upon the wish of the utility. That's no different now than that would make it very similar to what we're allowing the water utilities with drinking water projects. The other aspect is for us to authorize our secretary to develop rules and regs, create a certification program that not only deals with delegating the authority for review and approval to certain utilities with engineers on staff to approve water line extension projects, but also water line replacement projects now as well. We're in the process of developing those rules and regs. If this legislation passes, we will incorporate the amendment to look at replacement projects as well. The agency stands in support of this bill, as well as the companion sitting over in the House Ag Committee, which was heard yesterday. I'd stand for any questions.
Okay, committee, any questions for Tom? Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. How many loans do we have outstanding now in the state of Kansas?
Well, between both clean water and drinking water, I would say number tops over 100. Yeah, we can get a more precise number for you.
I'd be interested in that, and then what the balance is, just to get a flavor of what kind of exposure we have out there.
Exposure is an ongoing,
Right.
ongoing thing. Exposure really is not so much on the back end of what we're taking in terms of risk. It's us being able to have adequate cash flow to execute the next loan. And so we tailor all our financing to basically anticipate, are we in a position to take on additional loans and so forth. Situations where we think we're going to run into cash problems, that's why we issue revenue bonds to accompany the EPA capitalization grants and leverage those resources to allow us, on top of the repayments that are coming in from the existing loans year by year, to allow us to basically keep promoting more financing of new infrastructure on both the water and on the wastewater side.
Thank you.
Okay, good questions. Anybody else? Senator Peck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the Rule and Reg Authority, what is the process if an entity feels like the rules and regs are out of line for them or for the industry? How do they work on potentially changing or updating, or just can you walk committee through that briefly?
It's probably no different than any other administrative regulation that we would have to implement in order to implement a given statute there. We would put forth a draft proposal of what the regulations look like. We'll do that in full sunshine. We'll bring in utilities and their consultants to debate any particular issues that might come forth in terms of how we would implement this legislation. And then we will settle on what we think is the equitable and pragmatically important aspect of how those regulations will do, and then we'll roll them out there through both the reviews by Department of Administration and the AGs. Have a public hearing as well. If there's sufficient concern out there, it'll be expressed at that public hearing, and we'll have to take that into consideration to say if we need to do some modification of those regulations. And then finally, of course, as with all our regulations, we have to run it through JCAR here at the legislature to ultimately review what this new regulation looks like in front of that joint committee.
Mr. Chairman, the reason I bring that up, we all are aware that we had a vote last November that would have provided the legislature a little more leeway in changing rules and regs, because we've got rules and regs out there, not necessarily with this agency, but with agencies that we are confident are not legislative intent and not friendly to a lot of taxpayers. So that's the reason I bring this up. I'm just a little uncomfortable with allowing a little more rule and reg authority for a government agency, and I realize we've got to sometimes provide that authority, but that's the reason I asked the question for the committee's benefit. Thank you.
Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So walk me through the process before rules and regs are put into place. There's time for the public to have some input, correct?
Yeah, oh, yes. Well, the general public doesn't care about this overall. Who does is the utilities and their consultants, because they're the ones charged with putting things into the ground. What we have typically done is draft of regulations that would interpret this legislation and then say this is how we'll implement it. We will convene meetings with those parties, the utilities and the consultants, to lay out our proposal. We'll hear any pushback or alternatives they might suggest there. We'll consider those, and in some cases we'll incorporate them. We will then draft the package, run it through the legal review process, both internally and then through the AG's department. We'll run it through the Department of Administration for formatting, et cetera, and then we'll put it out for the public hearing. And that's when the general public, if they're so interested, could make comments on that. If those comments come in very pointed on that, we'll have to take that into consideration and maybe go back and offer up some revisions to that. To the senator's point, yes, in the aftermath of last year's election, he's correct. The legislature has no essentially veto authority over these regulations. I think the only other avenue is if utilities find that the way we are implementing it under our regulations represent a insufficient way of looking and implementing this law, the legislature can go into the underlying statute and put in place more directive conditions for the agency to then implement as well. That is the avenue that, because statute always governs regulation. So if someone doesn't like the way we interpret it under the current framework, legislature has the ability to go into the underlying statute and tie down some of those issues of concern.
I had Senator Fagg again. Oh, no, Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have kind of a two-part question. Is there any concern with instilling this much power in one person, specifically the Secretary of Health and Environment? And can you tell me the qualifications of the Secretary of Health and Environment that would qualify them to make such rules and regulations? And then the second part of that is, can you give a specific example of a rule or regulation that the Secretary of Health needed to be able to change to help in some water system?
Senator, really your question is more a global question of, does the executive branch have the cabinet officers in place that can do that? And that, the legislative process lays out what the statute is. It's up to the executive branch to execute and implement those laws there. To do that, we do interpretation through rules and regs. We can only extend those rules and regs as far as what the statute allows us to do. So there is still some implicit check and balance there relative to that. As far as the secretary in and of itself doesn't necessarily have the expertise, but she has within her power to hire appropriate staff to do that. We certainly have plenty of our engineers in place to do that. And in this situation, certainly on both fronts, we've got staff in place to exercise and implement and execute the SRF loans, and we have engineers that have done reviews of these water line replacements as well as water line extensions. This legislation works to our favor too, in that it delegates some of that approval of the review and approval authority out to qualified utilities that have engineers on staff to say, on these types of projects, you can do those there, as long as we've certified that you have the expertise at the local level to basically do that. As far as your example, last year we had a law to remove the prohibition of water projects that would utilize the Water Transfer Act from not being able to utilize the drinking water SRF. We had that removed. The legislature approved the bill, it turned into legislation. We then, this year, have just exercised the regulation to implement that, to basically remove that prohibition from our considerations in drinking water SRF loans.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have the honor now to serve on the Joint Committee on Rules and Regulations, and we did, in fact, look at that rule about the water transfer. So it seems to me that this will probably be a pretty straightforward regulation change. It will probably strike out 20 and replace it with 30. So the other thing that I was very pleased that other members of the committee were pointing out was that the legislature is now asking entities who are asking for these rules and regulation changes to make sure that they've publicized that and have had those meetings. So I'm glad that someone from the Kansas Municipal Utilities is here, and I'm hoping they'll put a story in their newsletter. So thank you. It seems to me a straightforward process, and this in fact, but we don't want to pass this legislation and then not have that rule to make it go into effect.
Thank you very much. Anybody else have a question? Thank you, Tom.
With pleasure. And my staff has sent in the numbers for you, Senator. Clean water SRF, we have $287 million outstanding balance across 226 loans. Current projects that are currently dispersing are 37 loans. On drinking water, $280 million outstanding balance spread across 152 loans, and there are 66 loans dispersing for current projects. My pleasure.
Okay, thank you,
Thank
Tom,
you.
very much for your, I appreciate your remarks and answering those questions. Is there anybody else that wants to speak as a proponent for this bill? Anybody else as a proponent? Seeing none, we do, on your instructions there, there's written only proponent testimony from Ellen Parker from Water One Water Districts in Johnson County and Wendy Stark from the League of Kansas Municipalities, who have a written proponent in this matter. Is there anybody else that wants to speak as an opponent? Anybody want to speak as an opponent? Seeing none, anybody want to speak as a neutral? Neutrals, none. We have no other opponents and no neutral at this point. Anybody have a question at the last here? Because we're going to adjourn. Thank you very much, and we'll close the hearing on Senate Bill 120. Committee, I want to remind you, we'll do a couple of bills got 2 or 3 bills left. We're going to get them done this week, and then hopefully pass those out, so then we'll be finished, other than the big water. Next week, Tuesday or Wednesday? Yeah.
What's the last day we can get them out? Pass them out? Tuesday? Okay.
Okay. With that, committee, we're adjourned.